story of people finding a new land is riddled with a lot of inaccuracies. In native talking circles, there's a belief that you speak until there's nothing left but the obvious truth. And our story seeks to uncover an obvious truth about America, a truth so obvious that it creates angst for anyone watching this evening. The story of the original Americans is a timeline and story from ancient BC. Historians have traced their ancestry back to North America as early as 1500 BC. It would not be until the 1400s when European travelers on exploratory expeditions would arrive in North America and begin what would become a tumultuous and inhumane relationship. Christopher Columbus was a Spanish explorer who sought out to find a direct water route west from Europe to Asia, but he never did. Instead, he landed at one of the Bahamian Islands. His travels would open the way for European voyages to the Americas. Regarded by many as an adventurous explorer, his claims would be the gateway to colonization and the eventual massacre of millions of indigenous people in the regions. The indigenous people welcomed Europeans to their land only to be captured and sold into slavery. They soon understood to be wary of the Europeans who brought disease and sought to take their lands. By the time the Pilgrims and the Mayflower landed, a horrible plague had wiped out entire villages, including the village in Plymouth. Relationships between the indigenous Americans and colonists soon deteriorated as settlers moved in to oust them from their lands. Between 1830 and 1850, there was a series of forced relocations of indigenous people from their lands, with very few remaining in the southeastern United States. This relocation would become known as the Trail of Tears. The federal government caved to white settlers wanting to grow cotton crops in these locations, so they forced the indigenous people to walk hundreds of miles to a designated territory across the Mississippi River, resulting in approximately 3,000 people dying while making that journey. Additional federal laws would then be passed limiting their rights and independence.
3,000 people died? That's terrible.
Yes, honey, it is terrible. What was once a continent of indigenous people, each tribe having their sovereign lands, would be forcibly taken by settlers with the help of the federal government. The preamble of the Constitution that spoke about establishing justice, ensuring domestic tranquility, and the general well-being and blessings for all people, well, I guess all people except the indigenous people, who are mentioned 3 times within the articles, sets a clear tone that the United States of America was not an America for all its inhabitants. And so tonight we're going to talk about and hear stories of a great people who will tell us the American history that many of us were never taught. Good evening, everyone. I'm Dr. Michelle Pierce Mobley, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Tabernacle Talks. And I'd like to welcome our guest this evening, Mr. Guy Jones. Welcome, Guy.
Oh, thank you.
I've got a lot of questions, and obviously we went through the intro, and that intro in no way tells the story, but I guess I'm going to get right into my questions. And one of the first questions I have, as a African American or a Black person, I know that what you are called evolves over time, and we have historically been called very derogatory names, beginning with the N-word, then went to colored, then went to people of color, then Black, then African American, and your people have had a similar trek. Do you mind explaining to us so that all of our audience understands what is the appropriate nomenclature to call Indigenous Americans?
I mean, one of the things is that I guess we have to what depth are we going to go? For an example, I am Hunkpapa Lakota. Hunkpapa is my responsibility, and the Lakota is the language with which my people speak. In the history books, we're referred to as Sioux. Sioux is an abbreviation of a French and Anishinaabe word that means low-down snakes. And when you begin to look at the names of all the nations of people who were here, they're all derogatory. But you have to remember who applied those names and who gave us those names. And that's where, like, even, a lot of times people will ask me to come and speak, and they'll say, well, what should we use? Should we use Indian? Should we use American Indian? Should we use Native American? I said, it really doesn't matter, because all three of them are wrong. And even now, people are using this term Indigenous. And, and there's a lot of people out there who don't comprehend what that even means. Because you see, in a lot of the terminology, we predate America. So that's one of the things is that, that I'm always, mindful, and I'm always sharing that with people, is that we predate America. And, to the point that, people need to understand that there was people that were here, that this is and I'm always first to remind people that, this is an occupied country. And so many people talk about freedom, and, we live in an occupied country. This country is an occupied land, and people forget that part. And so when you begin to look at terminology, and especially not only with just, my people, but terminology in relating to other people as well. And, and it's like, in that terminology is derogatory. And also, too, one of the things is that, like, even when I first came here to Dayton, I lived in Jefferson Township for a long time, and that whole conversation relating to Black, African American, and people were kind of they took a step back with me, because, I said, this, in a sense, I said, is divisive. These are divisive terminologies. When we talk about systemic racism, and that's the term that everybody's talking about these days, systemic racism, the depth of it, but nobody wants to go to those certain depths. But those terminologies that are applied and used, they're in fact very divisive, in a sense that, it's your claim as to your identity, your cultural and ethnic identity, goes back to Africa. And when you look at, the, other terminologies that are being related and stuff, even at that, it's like, oh, white people. And I'm like, okay, so what exactly is that? Or why are we not using terms like European American, or even, there's some people who use Italian American and Irish American, but, those are kind of getting old. You don't hear them very often anymore, but you used to at a time. But they're very divisive. And that's one of the things, is that, here we live in this country and in this land where all men are supposed to be created equal. And even at that in a sense is divisive, because, all men. So, we have to begin to look at the terminology that is being applied and how that's being utilized, and especially if we're going to have this conversation regarding systemic racism.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about your people predate North America, and I can only tell you from the history books that I read and was taught in school that Asian hunters came across the Bering Strait to North America. What say you to that?
Well, and I mean, if you talk to the people, and this is one of the things, is that we always have to be mindful about who wrote those books. And in a sense that, because our creation stories tell us that we were created and placed here. And even at that, when I first came here to Ohio, there was over 27,000 sacred and burial sites in the state of Ohio. Presently, there's only like 6,700. But there's a number of burials and these skeletons, and they were testing on these skeletons, because I'm like, well, how is it that you were able to determine and identify native skeletal remains? And because our teeth are different. we have a different bone structure than everybody else. We're very unique and in those areas. And so when you begin to look at that, and it's like, and everybody always, I always hear a number of scholars who talk about, the first man and first woman being in Africa. Well, genetically, we're different. Our bone structure is different, our teeth are different, and when you begin to look at even our history and our stories, in the sense that we were created and placed here, and that there was a migration, but that migration was from the south, north, going across. We crossed the Bering Strait going in the opposite direction, and other than what we're taught. Mm-hmm. So, that's our creation stories, all put us here. So we always refer to the Bering Strait theory as the BS theory.
Between 1776 and 1887, the United States seized over 1.5 billion acres from America's indigenous people by treaty and executive order. The invasion of America shows by mapping every treaty and executive order during that period. It concludes with a map of present-day federal Indian reservations. I think that's a powerful piece for people to understand, because I think even just talking about it, until you see it in those dramatic terms, you don't really get a sense of what absolutely happened and how horrific that had to be. In terms of indigenous people, they comprise right now about 2% of the U.S. population now. What numbers live on reservations versus in other areas? I want to get a sense from you of what the reservation is now, and just give our audience some perception of what that's like.
Well, it's like, supposedly the reservations are lands that are, and that are supposed to be ours, but in reality, these are lands that are held in trust. It's like we don't really own them. It's the government holds this land in trust for our use, and supposedly there's supposed to be 50 acres of land for every native person. And, and that's one of the things, is that, but the system itself was set up for our demise. And even now, they have, like a lot of times people will say, they'll want to know, are you full blood? And, which I am. But then there's a number of native people, that's just like, my children. My children are half, and my grandchildren are 1/4. Now, if my grandchildren don't marry a native person, then there's a generation that they're no longer legally, by definition, Indian. Even though they're raised knowing who they are culturally, spiritually, and and they know that history. Even though they know that history as to their origins, the system doesn't recognize them as being indigenous, as being native. And so that's just one of them that happens. And so when we talk about the millions, the 2 millions, those are people that are still hold on to that. That's like, a lot of times people will ask me about, the number of native people in Montgomery County here in Dayton, Ohio. And I've been here a while. There's quite a few. There's quite a few, in a sense that that's like, I know families here that a lot of times people say, well, oh, they're black. And I'm like, no, they're native. And I know their history. They know their history. And, and it's like, it's a broad spectrum. in a sense that, who is native. And it has to do with, that culturally and even knowing their stories. Because the stories are very important and in that identity, in that process of identity. And those stories, and that's one reason why, it's like, I tell my children all the time, but I'm very concerned in a sense that because I don't think my children are remembering them because of just the current lifestyle. It's, Dad, it's not like that anymore. But I'm like, it needs to be. These are our stories. And, these are the things that we need to remember. And, it's, because those stories give us, anything cultural. Culture is land-based. And that's one of the reasons why, like, even, I have a number of conversations with individuals who talk about culture. And it's land-based. And so, it's, let's have that conversation in regards to the land. And, and our stories connect us to the land. And there's a number of people even today that know their history. And it's like, and I'm not just talking Native people, but their connection to the land. That's how important land is. It's because those are our stories. After all, this is our mother. This is where we were created. We come from the earth.
Well, I have one final question, and I'll have a photo that I'd like to share because we talk about desecration of ceremonial grounds or grounds that were extremely sacred. Here we're looking at the 6 grandfathers, and I'm sure a lot of people don't know what that is because they probably know it more when they see the next picture. Can you describe for us, Mount Rushmore was the 6 grandfathers before these images were carved into that sacred area? Could you speak to the audience about that?
This is, we had that little conversation going in about the word sacred. And this is a very special place for us. This is where we came, this is ceremonial grounds. And this is where we came, to honor those that have passed on, to honor the birth, to honor unions. This was ceremonial. This was a very special place for us. And even our creation stories, in a sense that how those stories brought about and came about. And this is where, when we talk about our stories, the Black Hills, that's where we came. That's our origins. That's our Garden of Eden. And these people knew that. And they came here and they put those 4 faces right in the middle of our church, right in the middle of our synagogue, our temple. They put it right there. And they carved these 4 faces. And when you look at the history of these individuals and their treatment and their ideal in regards to the indigenous people, the native people of this land, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, all of them. Their treatment of native people, and just there was a policy of extermination. And when you begin to look at their governmental policies in exterminating native people, and I mean, it's like, and you see that played out in a number of different ways, in a sense that, I mean, it's the annihilation and extermination of native people in this land. At one time, there was a policy in this country is that, you kill the Indian and save the man.